Okay, we were just talking about this. You just had your beautiful daughter, Gigi.
Yes.
You are an estate planning attorney that knows everything about the estate planning world. I think an interesting spot to kind of kick off this conversation is, what did you do for your child, and what is something that a lot of listeners here having kids or have kids could start doing early on in life despite their financial situation?
Yeah. So the planning we did when Gigi was born was kind of twofold. One was getting our house in order, right? But second, also kind of planning for Gigi's future. And so we ended up setting up a revocable trust for my wife Lorna and I. And really that was set up so that if we were to pass away before Gigi's 30 or 35 years of age, her inheritance would pass in a trust with someone else in charge of that money until she gets a little bit older, a little bit more mature. And also what we left in that inheritance for her is protected from spouses in the future, protected from lawsuits, and has some estate tax benefits. And so some of the fun things, I guess, that we did is we put a prenup requirement in the trust. So it says that when Lorna and I pass away, Lorna's my wife, when we both pass away, before Gigi can get distributions from the trust, she has to get a marital property agreement in place saying that everything from that trust is her separate property. So it kind of takes the burden off of her having to ask for one by saying, look, we have access to this bucket of money, but you've got to sign this document first.
Interesting.
And so I really like that one. And I think a lot of folks that have young kids, especially our generation where we've seen divorce probably more frequently than prior generations.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing to do.
So basically you're taking the burden off of her having to ask her spouse, which can be very awkward. And you're basically taking the blame that, like,
yeah,
my dad made me do this.
That's right. Thing. Yeah. Kind of dangling the carrot saying, hey, you can get access to these, this trust fund, but you got to sign this paper first saying that if things don't work out, it stays with me.
Okay, so that spouse still has to sign something.
Correct. Still have to sign something, but it's
not something that she conjured up. It's something that you had.
Correct.
And if that person doesn't sign,
we have the ability to stop distributions to Gigi or the person in charge of her trust. They don't have to, but we'd probably rearrange things a little bit, create separate accounts, and do things a little differently if that happened to be the case.
What else did you do for Gigi?
The other thing we did for Gigi that I really like, and it goes back to the entrepreneurial spirit side of me, is we set up an irrevocable trust for Gigi. And we gifted some money into that trust, and we turned around and invested the funds in things like Fort Capital deals, actually, and some hard money loans out of New Jersey and New York. And the game plan for that money is that it's going to be invested and reinvested and allowed to grow until she gets 18, 20 years old, and she'll have a nice nest egg of money, again, asset protected from spouses and creditors. But that money can be used for anything. It's not a 529 plan that's only available for college expenses, right? It can be used for buying a first house, for wedding expenses, for college, or it can just be maintained for future investments. And one of the really important things for me is that I grew up, it's like I mentioned earlier, in Mississippi. I had no exposure to alternative investments other than just stocks, bonds, mutual funds. That's all I knew growing up. And so when I stepped into the estate planning world and got exposed to private equity deals and hard money loans and all these different types of investments, I realized how behind the curve I was. And I don't want Gigi to be behind the curve. So one of the interesting things about this gift trust that we set up for her is that as she gets older, we have the ability to sit down with Gigi, say when she's 18, 19 years old, show her the subscription documents that Fort Capital sends us, show her what we're looking at to decide whether or not we want to invest in this specific deal, and then make the investment with her, right? Mm. And so it's a great learning tool for her. And it's also, again, growing a nest egg for her that'll be protected and can be used for various reasons in the future.
And is that a plan that you can stamp out when you have possibly future children, or do you take because every child comes in there, you don't even really, they don't have a personality yet. You don't know what's going to happen. So do you kind of start with the same template for each child as they come into the world, or would there be any reason why you might do something different with baby number 2 than baby number 1?
Yeah, for my particular situation, I set up a trust just for Gigi, and if we have future kids, we'll do separate trusts for them. I think from a cost perspective, right, for me, it doesn't cost anything because I'm preparing the documents. For a lot of my clients, what I tell them is, let's just set up one trust. That's what's called a pot trust.
Yeah.
So all of the kids just share in this common investment fund, right, or combination of funds. And then once the youngest reaches age 23, maybe, or something, similar to that, we split it into separate trust.
Got it.
The reason why we split it at age 23 or around there is that by then the kids kind of have separate needs. And so if sibling 1 takes a distribution, it impacts sibling 2. And so we want to try to avoid that fighting by splitting the trust into separate ones at that time.
And real quick, just for clarification, then I want to get back to family. What's the difference between revocable and irrevocable trust?
Yeah. So other than just the terminology, right? Revocable means that you can change the trust over time. Irrevocable means that once you sign it, it's kind of set in stone.
Okay.
Right. But practically speaking, what's the difference? A revocable trust is really just a substitute for a will.
Okay.
That's really there's no real asset protection in a revocable trust. There's no spousal protection, and there's really no estate tax savings in a revocable trust. For your irrevocable trust, those that aren't able to be changed, they're going to have asset protection benefits. They're going to have estate tax benefits. And the trade-off is that you can't necessarily change and modify it as easily over time.
Okay. And if somebody's thinking about somebody that doesn't have a lot of knowledge, who's guiding them towards which one they should do? Is that what you're doing, or should they have consulted with somebody? How do they know which one is best to do?
Yeah, I think the best route to go is to meet with an estate planning attorney first.
Okay.
Financial advisors, accountants, they've got broad knowledge of these things. But I think when it comes down to the recommendation of what makes sense, probably best to have an estate planning attorney look at it. And it's not an either or scenario, right? We have a revocable trust, Lorna and I do, for our personal assets that will eventually funnel down to Gigi. And then we have an irrevocable trust that's really going to be used for her benefit during our lifetime before we pass away.
Okay. We're going to spend some time on the family because I got young kids, and I think a lot of listeners have young kids.
Yeah.
Okay, so you set up the initial estate plan when Gigi's born, but then you're going to have years before you kind of start figuring out who your daughter really is and what she likes and where she's going. You're going to be making more money or less money. Who knows what's going to happen? Some of the, I guess the friction around estate planning is like you're always doing it. What are some major milestones, or how do you think about like when are times to revisit the plan?
Yeah. So I think we generally say every 3 to 5 years, dust off your summary document and just make sure the people you name to serve in financial and medical decision-making roles are still the ones you'd want to serve, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of times as young adults in our first estate plan, we name parents as our backups a lot of times. And then as the kids get older, they migrate into taking those roles over from their grandparents.
Okay.
Right. But I think when the kids get to an age where you can start to sense, are they going to be financially capable of managing money? Right. That's a good time to kind of revisit the plan. If you notice a kid can't manage money, that's a huge issue, right? We really need to get out in front of that. I think when kids start to get close to marriage, that's another time to revisit things. And then I think ultimately when you have grandkids, I think there needs to be a pretty big sit down meeting to think, do we want to leave everything to the kids? Do we want to split it among kids and grandkids? Do we want to do college funding for the grandkids, right? So that's kind of that ultimate stage. So I think the estate plan is kind of a living, breathing thing that has to evolve over time because your life does.
Yeah.
But I think the big milestones are there's kind of a plan when you first start out, when you have minor kids. And we want to just review that to make sure all the roles we have, guardian designations, all those things are correct and still the right people. And then as the kids get out of high school into college years, that's probably the next like major revision piece, because they're probably going to start serving in medical and backup medical decision-making roles for you at that point.
Is there any trusts? I've never, when you think of these trusts, you think of kids or that are becoming adults before it really impacts them. Is there anything in some of the trusts that you've seen where it impacts them when they're in elementary school or middle or high school, or is it generally not till 18 and over?
Yeah, I mean, it's generally not going to be until they're adults.
Okay.
Certainly, there's always the risk that parents pass away prematurely, right? And then the kids inherit something. I think really the key is to have flexibility in your estate planning documents,
Yeah.
right? So like some examples that I can give you are that we have provisions about substance abuse, right? So if a beneficiary, typically a child, right, is struggling with alcohol addiction, drug abuse, mental health issues, we're going to have ways to require drug testing or send them to rehab and pay money on their behalf, but we're not going to put cash in a kid's pocket that has a heroin addiction, right? We want to avoid that. And so that's one way that we can build flexibility in the estate planning documents to adapt to things that may happen in the future.
Yep.
And that's where I think finding a good estate planning attorney can really make a difference, because flexibility is key, right? If we build enough flexibility in the documents, it should be able to evolve through all the various situations without having to be changed consistently.
Okay, you said can versus can't manage money. Managing money is not easy.
No.
And it's really not easy if you come from a wealthy family and you've never even had to really make money. I mean, I think odds would show that there's often very wealthy kids that grow up and money's just always around. And so it's not that they can't, it's they've really never been taught to.
Right.
What are some ways that you've seen? Okay, well, how are trusts set up to where if somebody can manage money, maybe it's set up X way, and if they can't, it's set up X way?
Well, in any trust, you've got a division or a separation between the trustee, which I refer to as the manager of the trust, and the beneficiary, the person that gets the distributions, right? The benefits of the trust. So if you've got a really financially savvy, capable child or grandchild, they can be the manager of their trust as well, right? They can make the investment decisions and the distribution decisions and really play an active role in managing the money for their own benefit.
Yep.
That's probably the most similar to like getting something outright,
Yep.
right? As a gift through inheritance, if they can be their own trustee and the beneficiary of their trust. When we have a scenario where a kid's a spendthrift, right, is the way we refer to it in estate planning, meaning they're not able to manage money well.
They spend it
They spend it, yeah, not very thrifty.
Yeah.
When that happens, we're usually going to want a different manager or trustee of their trust.
Okay.
Someone else that can manage the financial side of things and make distribution decisions for that child. And that can be multiple people or banks. So some folks tend to name a friend, right? Their thought is, well, I'll name my best friend because I trust him or her, and he or she knows the family well, so that's a great choice. Well, talk to that friend first, because being a trustee or an executor is a ton of work, and oftentimes the client doesn't realize it because all the work kicks in after they die, right? The other option is to go the bank route or a corporate trustee route, which I actually think is a great option. One is, yes, they charge fees for what they do. Every corporate institution does. That's how they make money, right? But if you hire your friend, they're going to go out and delegate the work to an attorney, a CPA, a financial advisor. By the time you pay for all three of those things, it costs about as much as the bank. But the benefit of the bank or the corporate trustee really is that it provides a buffer between the kid and the money. And so many times we see this where, especially if a child's come from an affluent family, they get out, they're in their 20s or 30s, and every single one of their friends is hitting them up to invest in a new restaurant deal or a new business they're starting. And so if we've got this corporate trustee out there, they can say, look, you got to talk to the bank. I don't control this money, right? Kind of gives them a buffer and kind of protects them from themselves as well. And so usually what we do in like our default kind of plan is that kids aren't going to be able to have any control over their money until they're, say, 30 or 35. At age 30, we'll let them step in and be a co-trustee of their trust, a co-manager. We're going to teach them how to use the trust for 5 years, and then we'll let them be in charge of their trust from that point forward. And those ages can be modified if we need to. And depending on net worth and the amount of assets in the trust, we may bump that to 40 or 45 or never, depending on the kid.
If you're listening to this and you are maybe came from wealth and you have a trust and there's a restaurant deal sitting on your desk, it's probably a good idea to pass on.
Yes,
They
that's
don't
right.
generally work out.
No.
When you mentioned addiction of some type, how does that work? Because people can be addicted and then they're not addicted, and maybe then they're addicted again. And you mentioned drug tests. Like, how do families usually set that up? And it doesn't even have to be around addiction. The more kids you have, there's typically one, sometimes more, that we'll call it marches to the beat of their own drum.
Yeah.
How do you handle situations, and I'm kind of getting away from the addiction part, where you have maybe 4 kids, 3 of them pretty normal, doing normal things. Maybe there's one that's just a superstar, and then you have one that's just always kind of the tough one. How do families handle that to where they don't let their wealth become the reason that one of their kids hates them or doesn't hate them? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So it kind of gets back to that trustee role, right? And the trustee, the manager of the trust, doesn't have to be the same for each of the kids.
Yeah.
And so the ones that are successful and are good stewards of money, we'll let them be in charge, while we're going to put someone else in charge of the other's money. What we don't want to do is put the responsible sibling in charge of the irresponsible sibling's money, because then they're just going to fight.
Yeah.
Right. And so much of this planning is looking at, how do we avoid the fighting? And I think it's often one of the most overlooked things in estate planning is our goal is not to just transfer money, right? It's to transfer money, but also a legacy, and keep the family intact while doing it. And so I think when we're looking at, to your point, the kid that marches to the beat of his own drum, we want him to have the same access to money and opportunities as the highly successful kid does, right? But let's put someone else in charge and make sure the money's going to last for that child's lifetime.
Yep.
And that's where we can put someone else in charge of that money. That's where it'd be that corporate trustee or someone we really trust as a friend to be in charge of that money.
Like, it's probably not a great idea to make the trustee maybe the father's best friend, because that person that marches to the beat of their own drum probably has a relationship with them. It can get, even that could get hairy. That's where you're saying a corporate trustee might be a little more kind of vanilla or bland and not as much emotionally swayed.
Yeah. And going back to the flexibility piece, right? We don't want to just name a corporate trustee and the child that marches to the beat of their own drum is stuck with that bank for the rest of their life. Right. So we'll give that child the ability to remove that bank and find a new bank.
Yeah.
Maybe only once every 5 years or for specific reasons. So we'll give enough flexibility to where if they get a really crappy person that's managing the trust, they can get out of that situation. But yeah, we don't want Uncle Brian, who everyone's really close to, getting separated from the family because he was named as a trustee of someone's trust.
Okay, let's go back to multiple kids. And now maybe we'll think about it just from like their career, where you might have one child that needs more distributions than another one. How is it typically set up to where I guess things remain fair over the long term? How do you see families set that up?
So there's kind of 2 situations, right? One is like when both parents pass away, right? We're going to have 4 separate trusts if there's 4 kids. And each of them may start off with their own 25% or 1/4 of the estate. And so that way, if child 1 burns through their trust, they haven't impacted the other 3, right? So that's one scenario is kind of how do we divvy it up at the surviving parent's death? We want to create separate trusts for each of the kids. But I think what you might have been asking is kind of during life, we're taking care of one child more than the other. And there's kind of 2 ways to do that. I mean, one way is to treat it like a loan, right? And just kind of ongoing documentation of how much you're transferring to them, treat it as a loan. They can either repay it over time, or when they die, that loan is kind of the asset allocated to their trust, right? So that's one option. The other option we do sometimes is treat it as what's called it's called an advancement on the inheritance.
Okay.
And so what that means is, on the back of the trust or back of the will, there's a list of here's all the things we gave John over the years. And all of these things are going to be treated as a prepayment of John's inheritance.
Yep.
So when John dies, we start off with an equal split, and then John is deducted that amount of money and it's given to his siblings. So both of those options work. And then some clients will say, look, we just appreciate that this child needed more and we don't want to track all these things. And so it's our money. We can do what we want with it. And we decided to take care of John. And so you guys get what's left over.
Is there anything else that comes to mind on just smart things that families have done when planning for their kids? Is there anything we left out?
Yeah. So a couple of things I've seen recently that I really liked. One is if you're charitably inclined, and a lot of your listeners may have donor advised funds simply because of the income tax benefits of setting one up, right? In a big year of liquidity. If you've got that donor advised fund and you are charitably inclined, what a cool way to get the kids involved in charitable giving early on, right? When they get to be 12, 13, 14, sit down with them, show them the list of charities, let them pick some charities that they're passionate about. And that's such a great way to create a legacy of giving if that's your cup of tea, right? So that's one that I really like. It's not even really an estate planning tactic. It's more so of just passing that legacy of being charitably inclined on. So that's one thing I find to be really interesting. Another thing that I saw, blended families are always the most complex. When I say blended family, I'm talking about you've got a second marriage, kids from prior marriages. How do we keep this whole thing together, right? It's probably 70% of my practice just because of the divorce percentages that we had as when we were growing up. And so I have one client in particular who the step siblings all get along great and they take annual trips and they do things together. So we actually created a reunion trust in their estate plan. So when mom and dad or stepmom and stepdad pass away, there's a sum of money that goes into this trust to fund annual reunions between all the step siblings. And I thought that was a really unique way of bringing the family together still, right? Because so many times, again, with blended families, what we see is that when mom dies, the connection to mom's kids is kind of severed. And this family really didn't want that. They wanted everyone to still come together. And so I thought that reunion trust was a really unique idea to kind of keep the family together.